A tow truck was blocking my driveway when I stepped outside that morning. The engine was already rumbling loudly, parked sideways across the entrance like a barricade. Thick chains rattled against the metal bed while diesel fumes drifted through the quiet street. Standing beside the truck was Elaine Carter, the president of our HOA, clipboard in one hand, a printed notice in the other. She looked at me and announced, loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear, "Your driveway has been identified as an unauthorized HOA access violation." Then she pointed at the truck. "Leave it right there," she told the driver. "This driveway stays blocked until the board finishes reviewing it." My car was trapped inside the garage. I couldn't even leave my own property. A few neighbors had already stepped onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. The tow truck driver climbed down and walked toward the entrance of my driveway. As he got closer, he noticed the small metal sign mounted on the wooden post. He leaned forward and read it carefully. "Recorded county easement private access." The driver paused, then he turned toward Elaine and said, "Ma'am, I can't legally block this driveway." Elaine didn't even glance at the sign. She crossed her arms and said, "You work for the HOA today. Keep the truck where it is." And that was the moment I realized something. Elaine thought HOA authority was the law. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, my life in that neighborhood was about as quiet and predictable as it gets. I work with my hands for a living. I run a small woodworking and furniture restoration workshop out of the detached garage behind my house. Most of my days are spent sanding old oak tables, repairing antique chairs, or bringing beat-up cabinets back to life. It's quiet work, patient work, the kind where you measure twice, cut once, and try not to rush anything. The property itself is perfect for that kind of life. I bought the house about 5 years ago, right on the edge of a newer HOA subdivision. My lot was actually older than most of the neighborhood around it. The house and driveway had been there long before the HOA expanded and built the surrounding homes. That driveway is more important than it might look from the street. It's the only access to my garage workshop. Every delivery truck that drops off lumber uses it. Every client who comes to pick up a restored piece uses it. And when I move heavy equipment in or out, that driveway is the only way it happens. When I bought the place, I made sure to check everything carefully. County records showed the driveway had been built over 20 years before the HOA ever existed, and it was protected by a recorded county easement. In simple terms, it meant that driveway was legally recognized and couldn't just be shut down by neighborhood rules. For the most part, life there was easy. I got along well with the neighbors. We'd wave when we saw each other, help shovel snow in the winter, and occasionally chat while grabbing the mail. I wasn't deeply involved with the HOA, but they mostly left me alone, and that worked just fine. But things started to change about a year ago. That was when the neighborhood elected a new HOA president, Elaine Carter. The first real conflict with Elaine Carter didn't start with a tow truck. It started with a letter. Elaine had only been the HOA president for a few months, but the entire neighborhood already knew exactly what kind of leader she was going to be. Before moving into the community, she had worked as a real estate agent, and during the HOA election she campaigned on one main promise: protecting property values. At first, most people liked the idea. No one wants their neighborhood turning messy or neglected. But once Elaine took control of the HOA board, that promise quickly turned into something else: strict rule enforcement. Almost immediately, violation notices started appearing in people's mailboxes. One neighbor got a warning about the shade of paint on his fence. Another received a letter saying her mailbox design wasn't HOA approved. Someone else was fined because their grass hadn't been trimmed along the sidewalk perfectly. Even parking became a problem. Elaine pushed new interpretations of old rules about how long vehicles could stay in driveways or along the curb. At first, most of us assumed it was just the usual HOA overreaction that happens when someone new gets a little too enthusiastic about their job. But then one afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a certified envelope from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice claiming my driveway violated a new HOA traffic regulation. I remember reading the letter twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. According to Elaine, the driveway that had been sitting there for decades was now considered an unauthorized access point that disrupted HOA traffic planning. That made absolutely no sense. My driveway had been there long before the HOA even existed. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I responded calmly. I emailed the HOA and attached every document that mattered. First, the county easement record, showing the driveway was legally protected access to my property. Second, a county property map clearly marking the driveway as an approved entrance. And third, the historical approval records from the county archives confirming the driveway had existed for more than 20 years before the HOA was ever formed. In my mind, that should have ended the conversation. But Elaine Carter didn't see it that way. 2 days later, I received a reply from her. It was only a few sentences long, but it told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to run the neighborhood. She wrote that while the documents were interesting, HOA authority could override prior arrangements if they conflicted with community standards. I stared at the email for a long time after reading it, because that wasn't how property law worked. Not even close. HOAs could enforce neighborhood rules, but they couldn't erase a recorded county easement. Still, Elaine acted like that distinction didn't matter. Within the next week, a new notice arrived from the HOA. This time my driveway was officially labeled under investigation. Apparently the board would be reviewing whether it created traffic hazards or violated updated HOA access guidelines. Around the same time, something else started happening. Neighbors began mentioning the situation in casual conversations. One guy across the street asked if I was planning to fix the driveway issue. Another neighbor mentioned hearing that the HOA believed my workshop deliveries were causing traffic problems. That's when I realized Elaine wasn't just sending letters. She was talking to people. The story spreading through the neighborhood made it sound like my driveway was some kind of reckless design flaw that had slipped through the cracks years ago, which was ridiculous. But rumors have a strange way of growing legs once they start moving through a community. For the most part, I tried to stay calm about it. I had the documents, I knew the law, and I assumed that once the HOA reviewed everything, someone on the board would point out the obvious and shut the whole thing down. But Elaine had other plans. About a week later, another notice arrived. This one said the HOA board was considering temporary restrictions on the driveway while their investigation continued. At the bottom of the letter, Elaine had added a handwritten note. It read, "Access may be limited if the board determines the driveway presents a community safety concern." That was the first moment I felt something shift. Because suddenly this wasn't just paperwork anymore. Elaine wasn't asking questions. She was preparing to do something about it. And a few days later, early in the morning, I stepped outside my house and saw exactly what she had decided to do. A tow truck was sitting sideways across my driveway. The tow truck driver didn't argue for long. The second he read the sign and understood what it meant, his entire attitude changed. He looked back at Elaine, then at me, then at the driveway again like he was mentally calculating exactly how much trouble this job could cause him. "Ma'am, I'm serious," he said, firmer this time. "If that's a recorded county easement, I'm not touching this. I'm not blocking legal access to private property." Elaine's face tightened immediately. She hated being challenged, especially in public and especially by someone she clearly thought she could order around. "I hired your company," she snapped. "This is an HOA enforcement matter." The driver shook his head. "That may be, but HOA enforcement doesn't override county law. I'm leaving." And just like that, the first showdown ended in a way Elaine clearly hadn't expected. The driver climbed back into his truck, reversed out of my driveway, and pulled away while Elaine stood there gripping her clipboard like she wanted to throw it through his windshield. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. She just stared after the truck. Then she turned to me and said in a low, angry voice, "This isn't over." She was right. It wasn't. Within 3 days, I received the first of what would become a steady stream of formal HOA violation notices. They arrived by certified mail, regular mail, and email, as if Elaine wanted to make absolutely sure I understood she was no longer bluffing. The first notice repeated the same claim that my driveway was a traffic concern. The second accused me of failing to comply with an active HOA review. The third included a fine. Then another fine came the next week. Then another. By the end of the month, the HOA had started stacking weekly penalties against my property. Every letter used the same stiff, official language, as though repeating something enough times could turn it into legal truth. But the accusations didn't stop at the driveway itself. They started expanding. According to the HOA, my property was now allegedly responsible for traffic hazards, because delivery trucks occasionally stopped near my garage. Then came the claim of zoning problems, even though my workshop had already been reviewed and approved under county rules before I ever bought the place. After that, Elaine began pushing the accusation that I was running unauthorized business activity in violation of the neighborhood standards. That part especially irritated me. I wasn't operating a loud industrial shop. I restored furniture. Most days, the loudest thing on my property was a sander or a truck dropping off lumber once or twice a week. I didn't have lines of customers clogging the road. I didn't have employees parking all over the street. But Elaine had figured out something useful. If she made the situation sound bigger and messier than it actually was, some people would believe her before they ever checked the facts. And that's exactly what started happening. The rumors moved through the neighborhood faster than I expected. At first it was subtle. A neighbor I used to wave to every morning suddenly avoided eye contact. A woman down the street asked me, in that careful way people do when they're pretending not to pry, whether I thought I'd have to make some changes to stay compliant. Another man mentioned hearing that the HOA had discovered my property had special zoning issues. That phrase stuck with me because it sounded so vague and official at the same time. It was exactly the kind of phrase Elaine liked using. Not specific enough to challenge easily, but serious enough to make people uneasy. Before long, the story being told about me wasn't that I had a legal driveway and a small workshop. It was that I had a questionable access point, a possibly non-compliant business, and a property the HOA was actively dealing with. Elaine was turning paperwork into reputation damage, so I stopped assuming the truth would speak for itself. I started treating the situation the way I handle a difficult restoration job, slow, methodical, and fully documented. My first call was to the county zoning office. I explained the situation from the beginning. I gave them my address, described the driveway, mentioned the HOA's attempt to block access, and asked the question that now mattered more than anything else. Did the HOA have any actual authority over that easement? The woman I spoke to took a while to pull the records, then transferred me to someone in planning who understood older subdivision filings. He reviewed the property history and called me back later that afternoon. His answer was simple: no. The driveway was protected by a recorded county easement. It had been legally recognized decades earlier, and because of that, the HOA had no authority to block it, remove it, or interfere with legal access to it. He said it so plainly that for a moment I just stood in my kitchen staring out the window, wondering how Elaine could possibly be pushing this so aggressively if the law was that clear. Then, I remembered who I was dealing with. Elaine didn't need to be right. She only needed other people to believe she was right long enough for pressure to do the rest. That was when I decided I wasn't going to rely on memory, verbal conversations, or common sense anymore. From that point on, I documented everything. I built a folder on my desk and another on my computer. Into it went every HOA letter I had received, every email from Elaine, copies of the recorded easement filings from the county, property history records, old subdivision maps showing that my lot and driveway existed long before the HOA's authority ever reached this side of the neighborhood. I printed duplicates and organized them by date. I highlighted sections. I wrote notes in the margins. I saved screenshots of emails and backed them up. If this was going to turn into a serious fight, I wanted a timeline so clean a judge could follow it half asleep. And apparently, that was a good instinct. Because while I was gathering evidence, Elaine was escalating again. One Friday afternoon, I came home from picking up wood stain and found bright orange warning cones placed near the entrance of my driveway. Not fully blocking it. Not yet, but close enough to send a message. There were also 2 temporary warning markers planted near the curb, the kind contractors use when they want people to think something official is happening. No county logo. No city seal. Just enough visual noise to make it look like my property was under some kind of legitimate restriction. I parked, got out, and stood there looking at them for a long moment. The cones were ridiculous on their own, but what they represented wasn't. Elaine was testing boundaries. First the letters, then the fines, then the rumors, then the tow truck, now the cones. Every step was designed to normalize the idea that my access could be controlled if she pushed hard enough. And standing there in my own driveway, looking at those orange cones like they belonged on a construction site instead of my property, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't an overzealous HOA president making a mistake. This was a deliberate campaign. And if I didn't stop it soon, Elaine wasn't going to settle for warning cones. The warning cones didn't stay the only sign of trouble for long. A few days later, the HOA sent out a notice announcing a special emergency board meeting. The message said the board needed to address ongoing safety concerns regarding a non-compliant driveway within the community. Everyone knew exactly which driveway that meant. I didn't attend that meeting, but word traveled fast in neighborhoods like ours. By the next morning, 2 different neighbors had already filled me in on what happened inside the clubhouse. According to them, Elaine had walked into the meeting with a thick folder of papers and a slideshow presentation. She opened the meeting by declaring that my driveway represented a potential safety hazard for neighborhood traffic patterns. The wording sounded official enough to make people uneasy. She claimed delivery trucks occasionally stopping near my garage created visibility issues. She said additional vehicle movement near my property could interfere with emergency access routes. She even suggested that the driveway itself had never been properly approved under the HOA's evolving traffic guidelines. Several board members apparently looked confused during the presentation. One of them asked a simple question. Wasn't that driveway already there before the HOA? From what I heard later, Elaine barely paused before answering. Older arrangements don't always comply with current standards, she said. Another board member asked whether the driveway was protected by county documentation. That question hung in the room for a moment before Elaine redirected the conversation back toward community safety concerns. By the end of the meeting, she pushed for a vote. The proposal wasn't to remove the driveway outright, at least not yet. Instead, she recommended authorizing enforcement measures while the HOA continued its investigation. Some board members were clearly hesitant, but Elaine had spent weeks framing the issue as a neighborhood safety matter. Once that idea takes hold, people often vote cautiously rather than challenge the person presenting the information. In the end, the board approved her recommendation, and once she had that vote, Elaine wasted no time using it. Within days, the HOA escalated its pressure campaign. The violation notices continued, but the language inside them became sharper. Each letter referenced the board's new enforcement authorization. The fines increased. And then the HOA's attorney, apparently someone Elaine had consulted, sent a formal legal warning letter. It claimed that failure to comply with HOA directives could lead to further enforcement actions, including additional penalties or property access restrictions. Reading that letter, I realized something important. Elaine wasn't trying to solve a misunderstanding anymore. She was trying to force compliance through pressure. At the same time, she continued shaping the public narrative inside the neighborhood. Several residents later told me they had spoken with her personally. During those conversations, she repeated the same arguments over and over again. She said my driveway created traffic concerns. She claimed my workshop deliveries were technically business activity violating HOA expectations. And perhaps most effectively, she suggested that unusual property layouts like mine could lower overall property values if they weren't corrected. Those arguments weren't necessarily accurate, but they sounded convincing enough to people who didn't have the full picture. By that point, I knew ignoring the situation wasn't going to make it go away. So I started taking steps that Elaine probably didn't expect. First, I scheduled a consultation with a property rights attorney who had experience dealing with HOA disputes. I brought the entire folder of documents I had been collecting, the easement filings, the subdivision maps, the HOA letters, and copies of every email Elaine had sent. He spent nearly an hour reviewing everything. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that confirmed what I had suspected. "The easement is clear," he told me. "The easement is clear to block it." But he also explained something else. Even when the law is obvious, disputes like this can still escalate if someone refuses to accept reality. In those cases, documentation and official oversight become critical. So the next step was simple. We filed a formal complaint with the county planning office, asking them to review the HOA's actions regarding the easement. Once the complaint was submitted, the situation moved beyond neighborhood politics. It became a matter of county record. A few days later, I received confirmation that the planning office had opened a review. They would examine the easement documentation and evaluate whether the HOA had attempted to interfere with legally protected property access. While that process started quietly behind the scenes, something else began happening out in the neighborhood. People were talking. The story about the tow truck driver refusing to block my driveway had already spread. At first, it was just a funny anecdote. Someone heard a driver told the HOA president no. But as the fines increased and the cones appeared near my driveway, residents began connecting the dots. Some neighbors started asking questions. If the driveway was truly illegal, why had the driver refused the job? If the HOA had full authority, why hadn't the driveway been removed already? And if the county had approved the property years ago, how could it suddenly become a safety hazard now? Those doubts didn't spread overnight, but they were growing. Unfortunately, Elaine didn't see them as warnings. She saw them as a challenge. And when people like Elaine feel their authority slipping, they often double down instead of stepping back. That's exactly what she did next. One evening, a neighbor who attended another HOA discussion stopped me while I was checking the mail. He lowered his voice slightly before speaking. "You might want to keep an eye on your driveway this week," he said. "Why?" He hesitated before answering. "Elaine's talking about physically restricting access until the investigation finishes." For a moment, I didn't respond. Because the thing about a recorded easement is that it doesn't just protect property rights in theory. It exists specifically to guarantee access. Blocking it isn't just a disagreement. It can become a legal violation. And if Elaine was actually planning to restrict that driveway again after the tow truck incident and the warning signs already in place, then she was about to make a mistake far bigger than sending letters or stacking fines. She was about to cross a line that the county might not ignore. Standing there by my mailbox, listening to the evening traffic pass through the neighborhood, I realized something. Elaine believed she was still controlling the situation. But the moment she tried to physically block that driveway again, the conflict wouldn't just be between me and the HOA anymore. It would involve people with far more authority than a neighborhood board. And once that happened, the outcome might not go the way Elaine expected. Once the county opened its review, I stopped trying to win arguments. Instead, I focused on something far more useful: evidence. Up until that point, most of what I had collected were copies of HOA letters, emails, and the easement filing attached to my property record. It was enough to prove the driveway existed legally, but I wanted something stronger, something that showed the driveway had been recognized long before the HOA ever existed. So one afternoon, I drove down to the county records office. Old property records are strange things. Some are digitized, others still sit inside filing cabinets or archived boxes that haven't been opened in years. After explaining the situation, one of the clerks helped me search through older subdivision documents connected to my property. It took nearly an hour. Then she pulled out a large folded document that looked older than most of the houses in my neighborhood, an original subdivision map. The paper itself was yellowed at the edges, but the lines were still perfectly clear. The lots were numbered, property boundaries were marked, and right there near the edge of the map was my parcel. And running directly across the map toward my garage was a clearly marked path labeled Private Access Easement. I leaned closer to read the filing date printed at the bottom. The easement had been recorded 15 years before the HOA was ever created. That detail mattered more than anything else. HOAs have authority over community rules, but they cannot erase property rights that existed before they were formed. If the easement had been created afterward, Elaine might have been able to argue that HOA approval was required. But this driveway wasn't something added later. It was part of the property's legal structure long before the neighborhood even had a homeowners association. I requested certified copies of the map and added them to the growing folder on my desk. At that point, the situation was becoming bigger than a disagreement between neighbors. Because once my complaint reached the county planning office, officials started taking a closer look at what the HOA had been doing. They reviewed the easement record. They examined the letters the HOA had sent, and they began asking questions about whether the board had attempted to interfere with legally protected property access. That kind of interference isn't something county offices take lightly. The planning department reached out to the HOA for clarification. They wanted documentation explaining why the board believed it had authority to restrict a recorded easement. I never saw Elaine's response, but I can imagine it wasn't the kind of explanation the county expected. While that process unfolded behind the scenes, another piece of the puzzle appeared in a way I didn't expect. It happened during a casual conversation with one of my neighbors. His name was Mark, and he had lived in the neighborhood longer than most of the newer residents. One evening, he stopped by while I was unloading lumber from my truck. He watched quietly for a moment before speaking. "You ever notice how many houses around here have been selling lately?" he asked. I shrugged. "A few. More than a few," he said. "Same buyer, too." That caught my attention. Mark explained that several nearby lots, especially older properties along the outer edge of the neighborhood, had quietly been purchased over the past year. Not by families moving in, but by a small development company. Apparently, they had been assembling parcels piece by piece. "What does that have to do with my driveway?" I asked. Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, if someone wanted to redevelop a section of land out here, older property layouts could get in the way. Easements, unusual access roads, stuff like that." I looked over toward my garage and the driveway that had suddenly become the center of an HOA investigation. Then it started making sense. If a developer wanted to reorganize the outer edge of the neighborhood combined properties, adjust access routes, maybe build something larger, older easements would complicate that plan. And one of the easiest ways to remove an inconvenient property layout isn't through construction, it's through pressure. HOA fines, compliance notices, constant investigations. Eventually, some homeowners decide the hassle isn't worth it anymore. They sell. Standing there in my driveway, listening to Mark explain the pattern of property purchases, a thought crossed my mind that I hadn't considered before. What if Elaine wasn't just being overzealous? What if she believed pushing older properties like mine into compliance or into selling was helping prepare the neighborhood for something else? I didn't have proof of that theory, but the possibility explained a lot. The aggressive enforcement, the refusal to acknowledge legal documents, the constant pressure campaign. If someone was trying to simplify property layouts, the easiest target would be a homeowner who didn't want to fight. Unfortunately for Elaine, I wasn't that kind of homeowner. And by that point, I had stopped reacting emotionally to every new letter she sent. Instead, I shifted my focus entirely toward legal preparation. Every new HOA notice went into the folder. Every email from Elaine was saved and printed. The certified copy of the subdivision map became one of the most important pieces of evidence I had collected. Because it didn't just prove the driveway existed, it proved the driveway existed before the HOA ever had authority over anything in that area. Once I had everything organized, my attorney helped prepare a formal documentation package in case the county requested it. The goal wasn't to argue loudly. The goal was to be ready. And judging by the way Elaine continued escalating the situation, it was only a matter of time before the dispute reached a moment where those documents would matter. That moment came sooner than expected. About a week later, the HOA distributed a notice to every house in the neighborhood. The message announced a community meeting at the clubhouse. According to the notice, the board would be discussing ongoing property compliance issues affecting neighborhood safety. But the line that mattered most was buried near the bottom. The meeting would include a final review of the driveway enforcement case. In other words, Elaine intended to bring the entire situation into a public forum. Neighbors would hear her explanation. The board would make decisions. And whatever happened next would unfold in front of the entire community. I read the notice twice before setting it down on my kitchen table. Elaine probably expected that meeting to reinforce her authority. But by that point, the situation had already changed. The county was reviewing her actions. I had documentation proving the easement predated the HOA, and the story about the tow truck driver refusing to block the driveway had already spread through half the neighborhood. For the first time since the conflict began, I felt something shift in my favor. Because once this situation moved into a public discussion, Elaine wouldn't be able to rely on rumors or assumptions anymore. She would have to explain her decisions, and I would finally have the opportunity to explain mine. The showdown she had been building toward for weeks was about to happen, and this time I wasn't walking into it alone. The night of the HOA meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it. Normally those meetings were quiet affairs. Maybe 10 or 12 residents would show up, sit through the agenda, and go home after discussing landscaping budgets or mailbox guidelines. But that night, cars lined both sides of the street. People were curious. For weeks, the neighborhood had been hearing about the driveway dispute, the fines, the warning cones, and most interesting of all, the story about the tow truck driver who refused to block my driveway after reading the sign. By the time I walked toward the clubhouse entrance, it was clear this meeting wasn't going to be a routine HOA discussion. Inside, nearly every chair was filled. Neighbors sat whispering to each other, some glancing in my direction as I entered the room. At the front of the clubhouse, the HOA board sat behind a long, folding table. Elaine Carter was seated in the center, her laptop open and several printed documents spread neatly in front of her. She looked confident. The kind of confidence someone has when they believe they control the narrative. The meeting opened with a few routine announcements, but everyone knew why the room was so full. Eventually, Elaine cleared her throat and leaned toward the microphone. "Our next agenda item," she said, "is an ongoing compliance issue regarding a driveway located on the east side of the subdivision." Several people shifted in their chairs. Elaine clicked a button on her laptop, and a slideshow appeared on the projector screen behind her. The first slide showed a photo of my driveway taken from the street. "As many of you know," she began, "the HOA board has been investigating whether this driveway complies with our community safety and access standards." She spoke in the calm, controlled tone she liked to use during official meetings. Elaine explained that the driveway could potentially disrupt neighborhood traffic patterns. She mentioned delivery vehicles occasionally stopping near the garage. She even suggested that the access point might interfere with emergency vehicle visibility. Every statement sounded serious. Every statement also conveniently ignored the fact that the driveway had existed long before the HOA ever governed the neighborhood. She clicked through several slides showing sections of the HOA handbook and various internal guidelines about property access and traffic safety. To someone unfamiliar with property law, it probably sounded convincing. But there was one problem with Elaine's presentation. None of those documents had the authority she claimed they did. When she finished, Elaine folded her hands on the table and looked out across the room. "At this time," she said, "the board will continue reviewing enforcement options to ensure our community standards are protected." That was my cue. I stood up slowly. "I'd like to speak," I said. Elaine's eyes moved toward me immediately. For a split second, something crossed her face. Surprise? Maybe, but it disappeared almost instantly. "Of course," she said. "Homeowner comments are welcome." I stepped forward, but I wasn't alone. The man standing beside me was my property attorney. A few residents near the front leaned forward slightly when they saw him. Elaine's expression tightened just enough for me to notice. "Before the board continues discussing enforcement," I said, "I think it's important that everyone understands the legal status of that driveway." My attorney opened a folder and removed several documents. He began calmly. "The driveway in question is protected by a recorded county easement," he explained. "This easement was legally filed with the county more than 15 years before the homeowners association governing this neighborhood was created." He placed a certified copy of the easement filing on the table in front of the board. Then he added the next document. "This is the official county property map, which clearly marks the easement as a permanent access route to the property." Another document followed. "And this," he said, holding up a larger sheet of paper, "is the original subdivision map, showing that the driveway existed as part of the property layout long before the HOA's formation." The room had grown very quiet. My attorney wasn't speaking loudly, but his words carried across the clubhouse easily. "Because of this," he continued, "the homeowners association does not have jurisdiction over the easement itself. The HOA may enforce community rules in many areas, but it cannot legally obstruct or restrict a recorded county access easement." A murmur spread through the room. People began looking back and forth between Elaine and the documents now sitting on the board's table. But the biggest shift came a moment later. Because my attorney wasn't the only person who had come to the meeting. Near the back of the room, another man stood up. He introduced himself as a county zoning officer. Several heads turned immediately. He walked toward the front of the room and addressed the board. "Our office recently received a complaint regarding possible interference with a recorded easement," he explained. "After reviewing the documentation, we confirmed that the driveway in question is legally protected under county property law." He paused briefly before continuing. "Based on those records, the HOA does not have authority to block, restrict, or interfere with access to that driveway." The reaction in the room was immediate. Whispers spread through the audience. A few residents exchanged surprised looks. Someone in the back quietly said, "So the HOA can't actually do anything about it?" At the board table, the tension was obvious. One of the board members picked up the subdivision map and studied it closely. Another leaned toward Elaine and whispered something I couldn't hear. For the first time since the conflict started, the power dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Elaine straightened in her chair and leaned toward the microphone again. "The HOA has always acted in the best interest of the community," she said firmly. "Our actions were based on safety concerns and the information available to us at the time, but the certainty in her voice wasn't as strong as it had been earlier, because now there were documents on the table that contradicted her narrative. The zoning officer had confirmed the easement, and half the neighborhood had just heard it. My attorney spoke again, calmly. "Our goal isn't confrontation," he said, "but continued attempts to restrict access to that driveway could expose the HOA to legal liability." That statement hung in the air for a moment. Liability. It was a word HOA boards understand very clearly. Several residents began asking questions from the audience. Did the board know about the easement? Why were fines issued if the driveway was legal? Was the tow truck incident authorized by the HOA? Elaine tried to respond, but the momentum had shifted. The more questions people asked, the harder it became to maintain the original story. Because the evidence sitting on the table wasn't speculation anymore. It was documentation. And documentation has a way of quietly dismantling even the most confident arguments. By the end of the meeting, the room felt very different than it had at the beginning. When people walked in, they had expected to hear about a homeowner violating HOA rules. Now many of them were leaving with a different question entirely. Had the HOA president just tried to enforce rules she didn't actually have the authority to enforce? Elaine still insisted the board had acted responsibly. But the doubt spreading through the room was impossible to ignore. And as the meeting finally ended, one thing had become very clear. The story Elaine had been telling the neighborhood was starting to fall apart. The morning of the final confrontation started quietly. Too quietly. After the community meeting, I expected things to calm down for a while. The documents had been presented, the county officer had confirmed the easement, and most of the neighborhood now understood the situation. But Elaine Carter wasn't the type of person who stepped back once her authority had been questioned. She doubled down. I realized that around 6:30 in the morning when the familiar sound of a diesel engine rolled down the street again. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then the sound grew louder and heavier. I walked to the front window and looked outside. Another tow truck was turning into the cul-de-sac. For a moment I just stood there, staring. The truck slowed as it approached my house, then pulled forward and stopped near the entrance of my driveway. The driver hadn't blocked the driveway yet, but he was close enough that the intention was obvious. Outside, a few porch lights flicked on. Curtains shifted. Neighbors had already started noticing. After everything that had happened, the meeting, the documents, the county officer confirming the easement, Elaine had actually gone ahead and hired another tow company. I stepped outside just as the truck engine idled louder in the morning air. And right on cue, Elaine Carter appeared again. She walked across the street toward the truck like she had been waiting for it. Clipboard in hand. Confident posture. The same expression she always wore when she believed she was about to win something. "Morning," she said calmly when she saw me. "You doing this again?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned toward the driver. "This is the property," she told him. "That driveway is not compliant with HOA access regulations." The driver glanced at me, then back toward Elaine. "So you want the driveway blocked?" "Yes," she said. "For how long?" "Until the HOA completes enforcement review." The driver nodded slowly and stepped out of the truck. By now several neighbors had stepped outside. One couple stood halfway down the sidewalk. Someone else leaned against their garage watching. A man across the street folded his arms as if he already suspected how this was going to play out. The driver walked toward the entrance of my driveway. And just like the first tow driver weeks earlier, his eyes immediately landed on the metal sign mounted on the wooden post. He slowed down. Then he leaned closer. I didn't say anything. Neither did Elaine. The street had gone quiet enough that I could hear the truck engine rumbling behind him. The driver read the sign once, then again. Recorded county easement. Private access. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but then something else caught his attention. Because next to the sign attached to the same wooden post was a second document, a printed notice, stamped. Official. He stepped closer and read that one too. This time he didn't need to read it twice. The paper carried the county planning department seal, and the message was very clear. The notice confirmed that the driveway was a legally protected easement and warned that any attempt to obstruct it could result in legal enforcement action. The driver slowly straightened up. Then he turned back toward Elaine. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you didn't mention this." Elaine frowned. "Mention what?" The driver pointed toward the post. "That easement sign, and the county notice next to it." Elaine waved a hand dismissively. That's irrelevant. The HOA has enforcement authority inside this neighborhood. The driver didn't look convinced. He walked back toward the truck slowly, clearly thinking through the situation. Then he stopped halfway between the truck and the driveway. Let me get this straight, he said. You want me to block a driveway that's marked as a recorded easement, and the county has already posted a notice saying not to obstruct it. Elaine crossed her arms. This is an HOA enforcement issue. The driver shook his head slightly. I don't think that's how easements work. By now the neighbors watching from the sidewalk were whispering among themselves. Someone quietly said, "Didn't this already happen once?" Another neighbor nodded. First tow driver refused too. Elaine's expression tightened. "You being paid to perform a service," she told the driver. The driver looked back toward the driveway one more time, then toward the county notice, then back at Elaine. I'm paid to tow vehicles, he said, not violate county property law. Elaine's patience finally snapped. This is HOA jurisdiction. The driver took a slow breath. Then he said the one thing Elaine clearly wasn't expecting to hear. I'm not blocking that driveway. And just like that, history repeated itself. But this time, something else was already on the way. Because a moment later, the sound of another vehicle approaching the cul-de-sac broke the silence. And it wasn't another tow truck. It was a county enforcement vehicle. The county vehicle rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. White SUV, county seal on the door. The moment it appeared, the quiet tension in the street changed. A few neighbors stepped farther out onto their lawns, curiosity turning into open attention. Elaine noticed it too. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, but she didn't move. The SUV pulled to the curb near the driveway and the engine shut off. A man stepped out wearing a light jacket with the county planning and enforcement logo stitched across the chest. He looked around once, taking in the scene. The tow truck, the neighbors, the driveway, and Elaine Carter standing beside the driver like she was supervising a construction project. "Morning," the officer said calmly as he approached. The tow truck driver pointed toward the wooden post near the driveway entrance. "Sir, I was just explaining to her about the easement sign and the notice." The officer nodded and walked toward the post himself. He read the metal sign. Then he looked at the printed county notice attached beside it. When he turned back toward Elaine, his expression wasn't angry, but it was firm. "Ma'am," he said, "are you the one who requested that this driveway be blocked?" Elaine lifted her chin slightly. "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association," she replied. "This driveway is under HOA enforcement review." The officer glanced briefly at the tow truck again. "Did you order the driver to obstruct the driveway?" "It's a temporary enforcement action," Elaine said. The officer exhaled slowly, like someone who had already expected this conversation. "This driveway is protected under a recorded county easement," he said. "Your HOA does not have the authority to block it." Elaine's voice hardened. "The HOA governs property compliance inside this neighborhood." "That may be," the officer replied calmly. "But HOA authority does not override county easements." The neighbors watching from the sidewalks had gone completely quiet now. Everyone could hear every word. Elaine tried again. "This driveway creates traffic concerns for the community." "That's not relevant to the easement," the officer said. He gestured toward the notice posted on the wooden post. "That document was issued after our office reviewed the complaint regarding interference attempts." Elaine frowned. "What complaint?" The officer looked at her for a moment before answering. "The complaint regarding attempts to obstruct a legally protected access route." Several neighbors exchanged looks. Someone quietly muttered, "Wow." The officer continued. "If the HOA continues attempting to block or restrict this driveway, it may constitute interference with recorded property access, which carries legal consequences." That word "legal consequences" landed heavily. One of the board members who lived down the street stepped forward from the small crowd of neighbors. "Wait," he said cautiously. "Does that mean the HOA could actually be liable for this?" The officer didn't hesitate. "Yes." Another neighbor spoke up. "But Elaine said the driveway violated HOA rules." The officer nodded. "HOAs can enforce community rules," he said. "But they cannot erase or override legal easements that were recorded before the association existed." The explanation was simple, clear, and impossible to argue with. Elaine looked around the street. For the first time since this entire conflict started, she didn't seem completely certain of her position. The tow truck driver folded his arms. "So, just to confirm," he said to the officer, "I should not block that driveway." "That's correct," the officer replied. The driver nodded immediately. "Good," he said, "because I wasn't going to." A few neighbors chuckled quietly. Elaine turned toward the driver again. "You were hired to perform a service," she said sharply. The driver shrugged. "Not a service that gets my company sued." Then he climbed back into the truck. The engine started again with a heavy rumble. And this time, instead of positioning the truck across the driveway, he shifted it into reverse and slowly backed out into the street. As the truck pulled away from the curb, the crowd of neighbors parted slightly to let it pass. The message couldn't have been clearer. Elaine stood alone beside the driveway now, clipboard still in her hand, but the authority she had been projecting for weeks had evaporated in front of half the neighborhood. The county officer spoke one last time. "I recommend the HOA review its enforcement procedures carefully," he said. Elaine didn't respond. The officer nodded politely and walked back toward his vehicle. A few moments later, the county SUV pulled away, leaving the street quiet again. But the atmosphere was completely different. Neighbors began talking openly now. So the driveway was legal the whole time? Why were fines being issued? Did the board know about the easement? Several people looked toward Elaine. She didn't answer, because for the first time since the conflict began, there wasn't a narrative she could control anymore. The evidence had spoken. The county had confirmed it, and the entire neighborhood had just watched it happen. By the end of that afternoon, word spread through the community faster than any HOA notice ever had. The board scheduled an emergency leadership review meeting, not about the driveway, about Elaine Carter, because once residents realized the HOA had nearly interfered with a legally protected property right, the question changed completely. It wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It was about who should be trusted to enforce them at all. In the days after the confrontation, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. For weeks, the street had been buzzing with rumors, violation notices, and the constant tension of an HOA dispute that seemed to grow bigger every day. But after the tow truck incident and the county officer's visit, the energy in the community shifted almost overnight. People were talking about something very different now. Not the driveway, not the workshop. They were talking about Elaine Carter. The emergency HOA meeting happened 3 days later. This one wasn't held during the usual evening schedule. The board called it quickly, and word spread through the neighborhood that the topic wasn't landscaping, budgets, or traffic guidelines. It was leadership. Several residents attended, including some who had never bothered with HOA meetings before. When the discussion started, the tone in the room was noticeably different from the previous gathering. Questions came first. Board members asked about the easement documentation that had been presented. They asked why enforcement actions had continued even after the county confirmed the driveway's legal status. They asked whether the board had been fully informed before voting on enforcement measures. Elaine attempted to defend her actions. She repeated the same argument she had used before, that she had been acting in the interest of protecting community standards and property values. But the situation had changed. Now there were certified documents on record, a county enforcement notice, and a public confrontation that half the neighborhood had witnessed with their own eyes. One of the board members leaned forward and asked a question that hung in the air longer than any of the others. Were we advised to obstruct a legally recorded easement? Elaine hesitated before answering. That hesitation was all the room needed. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to begin an immediate review of the HOA's leadership structure. Within 48 hours, Elaine Carter resigned as HOA president. Officially, the statement said she stepped down to avoid further community conflict. But everyone in the neighborhood knew the truth. The confrontation at my driveway had made it impossible for her to maintain authority. Once residents realized the HOA had nearly interfered with a legally protected property right, the conversation changed completely. People stopped asking whether the driveway violated HOA guidelines. They started asking how the board had come so close to making such a serious mistake. The board moved quickly to repair the damage. At the next meeting, they introduced a series of policy reforms designed to prevent something like that from happening again. The biggest change involved enforcement verification. Before issuing any fines or compliance notices involving property structures, access points, or land use, The HOA would now be required to verify the claim against county property records and easement filings. No more relying on assumptions, no more interpreting HOA guidelines without checking whether those guidelines actually applied to the property in question. Another rule required the board to consult legal counsel before attempting any enforcement action that could interfere with property access. In other words, the HOA would have to confirm its authority before acting, instead of trying to prove its authority afterward. For many residents, the reforms came as a relief. Over the next couple of weeks, something else started happening too. Neighbors began stopping by my driveway. Some came over while I was working in the garage. Others caught me while I was checking the mail or unloading lumber from the back of my truck. The conversations were usually short. A few people admitted they had believed Elaine's explanation when the conflict first started. The story about traffic hazards and business violations had sounded convincing enough at the time. Others said they simply assumed the HOA must have verified the situation before issuing fines. One older couple who lived 2 houses down brought over a plate of homemade cookies one afternoon. "We should have asked questions sooner," the husband said quietly. I appreciated the gesture. The truth was, most of the neighbors hadn't been malicious. They had simply trusted the person in charge to know what she was doing. Once the facts became clear, most of them adjusted quickly. A few even admitted the situation had made them think differently about how HOA authority should work in the first place. Meanwhile, the county planning office officially closed their review. The final notice they issued confirmed what had already been established during the meeting and the confrontation outside my house. The driveway remained protected under a recorded county easement, and that easement could not be restricted by HOA enforcement actions. In other words, the legal situation was now fully documented and reaffirmed. For the first time in weeks, the stack of HOA letters on my desk stopped growing. The violation notices stopped. The fines disappeared from the HOA ledger, and the bright orange warning cones that had once been placed near my driveway entrance quietly vanished one morning. Life slowly returned to something close to normal. Delivery trucks came and went the way they always had. Lumber shipments arrived for new restoration projects. Clients occasionally stopped by to pick up repaired furniture or discuss upcoming work. Inside the garage workshop, the steady rhythm of sanding, staining, and careful craftsmanship replaced the constant distraction of legal paperwork and HOA correspondence. The entire conflict that had consumed so much time and energy gradually faded into the background. But there was one moment, a few weeks later, that stayed with me. I had just finished restoring an old walnut dining table for a customer across town. It was a heavy piece, the kind that requires careful handling to avoid damaging the finish. I loaded it into the back of my truck, secured the straps, and climbed into the driver's seat. Then I started the engine and slowly backed out of the garage. The truck rolled down the familiar stretch of concrete toward the street. No cones. No tow trucks. No clipboard-wielding HOA president standing at the curb. Just the quiet neighborhood street and the open driveway that had always belonged there. For a moment, I paused at the end of the driveway before pulling onto the road. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No crowd. No confrontation. Just the simple act of leaving my own property without anyone trying to stop me. After everything that had happened, that small, ordinary moment felt strangely satisfying. The driveway that had nearly become the center of a legal dispute was once again just a driveway. Protected by law. Recognized by the county. And now fully understood by the neighborhood that had watched the entire conflict unfold. As I drove away to deliver the finished table, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The garage sat quietly at the end of the drive, sunlight reflecting off the metal sign on the wooden post. The same sign that had stopped 2 tow trucks and ended a dispute that never should have started in the first place. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a courtroom verdict or a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it's something much simpler. Sometimes it's just the right to use your own driveway in peace again. A few weeks after everything settled down, the neighborhood finally returned to the kind of quiet it had before the whole situation began. No rumors, no violation notices, no tow trucks showing up at sunrise. Just the usual sounds of a normal street dogs barking in the distance, someone mowing their lawn, a delivery truck passing through every now and then. Standing in my driveway one evening, I thought back over everything that had happened. What started as a simple disagreement had turned into something much bigger. Not because of the driveway itself, but because of what the conflict really represented. It was never just about concrete and property lines. It was about authority versus legal rights. HOAs exist to help communities run smoothly. They create guidelines that keep neighborhoods organized and well-maintained. Most of the time, those systems work just fine. But what this experience reminded me is that HOA authority still has limits. No neighborhood rule can erase a recorded legal property right. And when someone tries to push past that boundary, the best response usually isn't anger or shouting. It's preparation, documentation, and patience. The documents sitting in that folder on my desk, county maps, easement filings, property records, ended up being far more powerful than any argument I could have made. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves once the right people are forced to look at them. Eventually, the truth catches up with the situation. Looking down the street that evening, everything felt normal again. The driveway stretched from the road to the garage just like it had every day since I bought the house. The wooden post at the entrance still held the same metal sign that had stopped 2 tow trucks and changed the course of the entire dispute. Beyond it, the neighborhood sat calm and quiet under the fading light of sunset. Life had gone back to routine. And honestly, that was the best outcome I could have hoped for. But I know situations like this aren't rare. HOA disputes happen in neighborhoods all over the country. Sometimes they're small misunderstandings. Other times they grow into something much bigger than anyone expected. So now I'm curious. Have you ever had an experience with an HOA that tried to push its authority too far? If you've dealt with something similar, whether it was a parking issue, a property dispute, or a rule that didn't make sense, I'd be interested to hear about it. Feel free to share your story down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about real neighborhood conflicts, property rights battles, and the kind of quiet justice that comes from standing your ground, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes the biggest fights don't happen in courtrooms. Sometimes they happen right at the end of someone's driveway.